Sorry, I didn't intend for my bio to be that long, but good morning, everybody. My name's Kahreen Tebeau. I'm a policy advisor at Seattle Public Utilities, which provides all of the drinking water for Seattle. And I found this discussion really interesting so far. I kept wanting to jump in, but I held my horses until now. So I look forward to the discussion today. I'm here to talk about water affordability, how and why that's a problem and possible solutions. So it's a little bit broader, but we will talk about predictive analytics. So when we talk about the problem of water affordability, what are we actually talking about? I think all the different speakers today are getting to this, but I could kind of have a bit of a different take on it. So from my perspective, we really have two problems that are interconnected. On the one hand, we have advocates, consumer advocates, public health advocates, human rights advocates who say that, you know, clean water is a basic human right, and water utilities, such as the one I work for in Seattle, should charge much less for it to make sure it's affordable for everybody. And then on the other hand, you have conservation activists, economists, who say, you know what, this is a really precious resource, perhaps our most precious resource. And the price we're charging, as high as it may be today, is actually less than the true value of it. This price should actually be higher if we want to appropriately reflect its costs and its value and thereby conserve it. So which of these two perspectives is right? In my opinion, they both are. And that's why it's such a complex problem. Water affordability, to me, is really about trying to solve for these two different problems at the same time. And although, you know, it's very difficult and complex, I do believe that we can solve for them together, and that there are a number of potential solutions out there already. So a lot of this has been discussed today, but just to give a little bit of an example from Seattle, a place with relatively abundant water, your average water bill is about $200 per month from our utility. It's actually about $225. So it's about $450 every 2 months when you get your water bill. It's a lot of money. So for working class and increasingly for middle class families, it's just getting harder and harder to afford that bill. And that price has been steadily increasing for I don't know how many decades, and we expect it to continue to go up. We just put in a request to increase our rates for the next rate cycle. So sacrifices are being made to pay that water bill. And, you know, everybody knows this, everybody needs water, right? Our fundamental biology requires us to have water to live. But I think what a lot of people don't recognize is it doesn't just hurt someone's physical health to not have access to water, right? It also hurts their social health. It impacts their ability to participate in society. If you don't have clean clothes and you can't bathe, you can't participate in society, you can't go to school, you can't go to work. So it really impacts a human being's total well-being. But getting water to people, managing water has become exponentially more difficult and expensive for water utilities. Water utilities really find themselves at the epicenter of climate change and the impacts that that's having on the entire hydrologic system. So at SPU, Seattle Public Utilities, we manage the entire watershed for our region, and climate change has made that system increasingly variable, increasingly unpredictable, so that a steady, reliable supply of fresh water is no longer something that we can take for granted. Our job now is increasingly just to manage the impacts of climate change, like having too much supply of fresh water in the system, like during a storm surge, overwhelming the capacity of the system, causing flooding or overflows, or too little water in the system, like during a drought. And the infrastructure that it takes to do that, to mitigate those risks, costs hundreds of millions of dollars for a single utility. Most of the Western US, as I'm sure you all know, given this audience, it finds itself in a mega drought. We don't know when it will end. We saw unprecedented heat waves this summer. It got up to 116 degrees in Portland, Oregon, where my parents live, 108 degrees in Seattle. The Colorado River and other rivers that we've relied on for water are drying up. I don't think we've ever been as more acutely aware of how scarce this resource could become, and how quickly that scarcity could become a disaster. And not just for humans. I mean, it's not just humans that need water. We also need water for ecological purposes, for natural systems. And in many cases, we actually need to put water back into those natural systems, like restoring wetlands or creeks. So when I talk about conservation, it's not just for human use, but for ecological purposes as well. So on the one hand, we have this thing that everyone needs. And on the other hand, we have an increasingly scarce supply that's more and more difficult and expensive to manage. So it is a complex problem, but the good news is there are potential solutions already out there. I really see three different kinds of solutions. I see policy level solutions, program level, and technology. And I'm going to talk about a few of those today. There's probably many others, and I would love to hear your thoughts and ideas about that. So first, I am a policy person. I confess that. I have a PhD in political science, and I've spent my whole career doing policy work. So I do believe in the power of public policy to help us with these big problems. But to get there, to these policy solutions, I think we really need a culture shift in how we think about water. Currently, we really see it as a commodity to be bought and sold on the open market. I mean, there are utility regulations. Most utilities are heavily regulated in one way or another, especially concerning environmental requirements and regulations. But whether they're public or private, utilities have to fund their own operations. That's been discussed today. We have to fund our own operations. We have to fund our own infrastructure. At Seattle Public Utilities, we get zero public funding. And by public funding, I don't mean cheap loans. Loans are loans. So the SRF fund, it's great for loans because it gives you, very low cost loans, but you still have to pay them back. So in order to cover the cost of providing our services, we have to raise our own revenue. And the only way to do that is by charging fees for the water we provide. And we are not unique in this. Water utilities across the country are in the same boat. We don't get public funding. We have to deliver this critical service, which is expensive and increasingly expensive to deliver. So in effect, we have to operate like a corporation, even if we're a public agency. We have to charge enough to cover our costs or we would not be able to operate. 50 years ago, the feds used to invest a lot of grant money in water infrastructure. I think there was a graph on that that clearly showed that. That's not true anymore. So water and the infrastructure that cleans it, stores it, manages it, delivers it, has become basically a privately funded commodity, and it's funded by private utility customers. And as we're finding, it's too expensive for utility customers to pay for on their own. So I think part of the shift that we need is to start seeing water as a public good, the same way we see universal public education. It's an investment in our community, in our workforce, in our nation and its future. So, when a child doesn't have access to education, we don't just see that as impacting that child and its family. We see that as impacting our whole society. We have an interest society-wide in that child being educated. And to me, water is no different. Public investment in water grants is an investment in the health and prosperity of our whole society. When someone doesn't have access to clean water, they really can't participate productively in our society. So the first public policy shift is federal investment and grants in water, and that culture shift to see it as a public good for the nation. The second policy shift is that local governments need to stop taxing utility services to fund their budgets. In Seattle, the city of Seattle government adds a significant tax to utility services. On water, it's over 15%. And of course, that tax is passed to the utility customer because the utility doesn't have any way of paying for it. So folks are not only paying their expensive water bill to the utility, they're also paying a significant tax on top of that to the city. And the city makes just on the water tax alone over $30 million a year. So prohibiting local governments from taxing water would also be a major step in the right direction in making water more affordable for everyone. I think those two policy solutions are could be pretty powerful combined. And as we talked about a little bit earlier, we might see some real headway on federal investment in water in the Biden infrastructure package. We'll see. I think removing local utility taxes is something that would take a lot of local work. Local governments aren't going to be eager to give up that source of pretty sizable and reliable funding for their budgets. So in addition to these policy levers that I've discussed, if water prices need to stay relatively high to promote conservation and to reflect the real cost of water, which I think they do, in addition to the Fed subsidizing part of that cost, I also think we still need, at the utility level, to do a better job extending utility discounts and other forms of utility financial assistance to lower income households. We have a great utility discount program in Seattle. It provides 50% off the water utility bill for low-income households after they enroll, so it just cuts their bills in half. But we all know, as has been discussed today, that enrolling in government programs is difficult. It's frustrating. It's a lot of navigating bureaucracy and websites and forms and call lines, and it's difficult for everybody. But particularly, if you're struggling financially to make ends meet, and if you have other barriers like a language barrier or a disability on top of that, it becomes pretty impossible. So we are exploring ways to make this better in Seattle. We're just embarking on a new project to see if using predictive analytics can help us. Basically, we combine our internal private confidential customer billing data with publicly available data sets like the American Community Survey and census data. We combine about 280 or so variables together in this predictive model, and it shoots out a number, a score, if you will, that tells us whether an individual customer of ours is more or less likely to qualify for our utility discount program. So by telling us which households are likely to qualify, we can do the work to reach out to them rather than making them navigate a maze to get to us. And hopefully by doing that, we can make it really simple and easy for them to sign up for this really sizable discount. And finally, I also have a lot of optimism about the potential for technology to help us solve this sort of dual problem of increasing access to water while also managing increasing scarcity. I think there's a lot we could learn from countries and regions of the world that have long histories of managing a scarce freshwater supply. And because of that scarcity, have created systems that manage water much more efficiently. It still rains a lot in Seattle, not nearly as much as it used to, but given the impacts of climate change, we need to change our mentality from one of abundance, which results in a lot of wastefulness. I mean, we're still using fresh, clean, potable drinking water to flush our toilets. Probably not the most efficient use of it. We need to change that to one of scarcity and efficiency and design and utilize technology to that end. And I feel like every other week I'm reading about some cool new water technology in the news, like pulling water out of the air or cleaning it much more cheaply or doing desalination much more efficiently. One of the exciting things we're working on at SPU, one of my teammates is working on, is looking at the potential for more decentralized water systems. We have a very heavily centralized water system like most cities in the US do. But in a place like Seattle where it still rains a lot, what's the potential for households to capture that rainwater and use it in a more decentralized way? And what are the technologies that they would need to capture it and clean it and use it? So that's one of the things that we're exploring on the technology side that I think has a lot of potential and that I'm excited about. So in closing, I guess I'd just like to say, this is a difficult problem. I'm happy to be here today with all of you to discuss it. And I really welcome the thoughts and ideas of a partner like the Sierra Club that has sort of this conservation ethic up front and thinking through this difficult problem. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Esther, do you have any?
We just have one comment in the chat, and that question is, what is the alternative to taxing water?
Yeah, I mean, The city would have to find another revenue source to fill that budget hole, right? I mean, the water tax alone generates $30 million a year for their budget to fund other programs, general fund programs. So, and collectively on all the utility taxes, I think it's over $100 million a year that the city of Seattle collects and uses to fund other general fund programs. So they would have to come up with a different kind of tax, like a corporate tax or some other kind of sales tax or something. I just think that water especially should be untaxable. And I'm also happy to have the other presenters join in today. I think there's a wealth of knowledge on this panel and I don't need to monopolize it.
So I'm joining in the call to Alexandra and Katie. If you all want to weigh in, assuming you're still listening. I'm inviting questions that I'm going to ask.
Elaine lives in Seattle, so maybe she has her hand raised, and there's another participant, and also has her hand raised. So
yeah, I'm following up on my question earlier about the study that was presented earlier that Seattle didn't have laws that address this issue, and I'm glad to hear this last presentation because Seattle very regards equity is very important, and I believe we have a moratorium right now, Kahreen, don't we, on shutoffs, and we have for a long time. And I'm glad you brought up the issue of conservation because in Washington State, and I chair the Sierra Club's water committee in the state, we do talk a lot about conservation, and I think that is a really important piece of this. And so thank you for bringing that up. And yeah, that's it.
Yeah, most utilities have had some kind of a moratorium in place during the pandemic. And there's going to be a lot of, it's going to be a difficult shift back to normal business operations or the new normal, whatever that looks like after the pandemic.
Alexandra, it looks like you've got your hand up. And you qualify as a former speaker, so ask away.
Well, so I have a question, but I also wanted to make a comment. So, I mean, I think this is exactly, I think Elaine and Kahreen demonstrate the importance of law because the utility of Seattle has stepped up, right? They have stepped up and said, okay, equity is important. We're going to create this consumer assistance program, regardless of what the law allows us to do or not do, right? But in other communities, they're not making that decision. And so the importance of the law is that the local legislatures say, we prioritize equity and you are going to have to do this, right? Our community has spoken for you. And that's why utility leadership and the law is so critical and why the city of Seattle stands out, but their laws don't require them to do that. And that's a really important distinction. They're not forced to do it. They've stepped up and they've taken that leadership position. And I commend them for that. And I think that's great. And typically in our research, we look at both the law and practice. But I think that's really critical. The one question I do have, because I'm actually really interested, it's come up a lot recently. So the taxing of water systems, I mean, is this common? And you said something about $30 million. So does this money go into the general fund? It's not actually required to be ring fenced for water and wastewater infrastructure. And thank you.
That's correct. It goes into the general fund. The utility does not see any of those tax dollars, and it's used for anything that the city wants to use it for. My understanding is it's pretty common for local governments to tax utilities.
Ann Finneran?
Yeah, so that was actually my question too, and thank you, Alexandra, for elucidating on that. So it really is, it's almost more of a problem that people are they're just using it to collect revenue and not to cover the cost of the infrastructure. So any remedies in that regard or suggestions? Anybody got anything on that?
I mean, I think the law could be useful. If we at the state level prohibited local governments from taxing water, then they wouldn't be able to tax water anymore. But again, it would be a really big battle because giving up that huge source of money would impact cities, and it would be a tough transition. You know, you'd have to shift those costs to another taxable group, right?
So do they meter water in Seattle? Do they meter water usage?
Yes.
And that is the basis of the taxation?
Yeah, you basically pay 15% on top of whatever your bill is.
So, but it's not, so then it seems that the cost is higher than it needs to be for what they need to do to it. So the taxes are too high, essentially.
Yeah, the taxes are huge. Yeah.
I'm still trying to think in my head about a way to pay for it, other than, you know, charging the users. It seems like, but that maybe the term taxation it needs to be adjusted or something.
Yeah.
A usage fee or something, and then, yeah, so still got to make.
I mean, it's basically a sales tax on the utilities that you buy.
But the purpose of it is really screwy.
Yeah, it's not used for water infrastructure, or anything related to utilities. It's used for completely separate programming in the city. So it's just an extra thing that's tacked onto the price of that has nothing to do with it.
Technically, we have 2 minutes left, but I think we have a 10-minute break, so we can go past the 2 minutes. Doris, it looks like you've got your hand up, and then I may recognize myself.
Thank you. I live in Portland, Oregon, and I've been worried about this for a long time. I live in a neighborhood with lots of poor people, and also people, well-to-do people who, even during the terrible heat in Portland recently, they were just using lots of water. And so I asked the city, the water utility, have you considered a rate structure that would allow a low rate of water, as they do in some cities, for those who don't use a lot every month, and then increase the price when you go way up? There was an expose in Willamette Week about city government people who have big homes and swimming pools and use a lot of water, and they all pay the same bill. So the city told me, we have absolutely no interest in that kind of rate structure. End of story. So should I keep pushing on them?
I think you should. I mean, I know it's something we're looking at in Seattle. We already have a rate structure in Seattle that is a block structure where, you know, the first block costs X amount and the next block costs more and the next block costs more. So the more you use, the more expensive it gets. So swimming pools and ornamental lawns, those folks do end up paying more for that water when they get up into a high usage amount. And we've also looked at, you know, what would it take to charge very little for sort of a lifeline amount of water. The problem is that there isn't always a good correlation between being low income and using a very small amount of water, right? And so what you end up with is, and in fact, sometimes low income households use more water because maybe, you know, they have poor, inefficient plumbing. Maybe there's, you know, multi-generational family living in the household. Maybe there's a lot of situations where low income doesn't always mean low consumption. And you don't want to set up a rate structure that inadvertently hurts low income households. So it's a tricky problem, but I think it's one that every utility should really be considering, is what can they do with their rates. And I know our rates are very strictly regulated in the state of Washington. We're not actually allowed to charge a different rate structure for different kinds of customers, with the exception of this discount program. So we're a little bit constrained, but I still think it's definitely worth looking at.
Thank you. I will tell them about Seattle.
Okay.
Kahreen, I was delighted to hear you refer to the category of folks who believe that water is too cheap. And I have given that speech across Kentucky in various forms of my Clean Water Act 101. And I've included in my presentation a quote from Adam Smith in Wealth of Nations on value and worth, where he compares diamonds and water. And he notes that diamonds actually do nothing to help anybody, have great value, in exchange for something, and water is essential, but it has no value in exchange for something. It buys nothing. But whether that complicates the discussion of water affordability, I'm responding positively to that category you put me in.
Oh, well, thank you. I think it's a very legitimate perspective. You know, we have to think about how valuable it is and how we appropriately, you know, assign value to it. And in a market economy, it's tough, but we've got to find some solutions to that. So I appreciate your comment.
Esther, do we have anything else waiting before we adjourn this one? And we may actually be able to take a short break, and we will convene the next panel at 12:30. Anything, anybody want to add anything?
It was a request from for Katie, I think. Would it be possible to repost the map of water affordability? And
yes, I put it in the chat. It's from the census. I can pull that out and put it back at the bottom too.
And then while she's doing that, the last question is the last question from the chat, actually. Everything else has been answered. Please explain the difference between caps versus cheap water for everyone regarding water conservation.
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Mm-hmm. This is actually a question from Katie's presentation. Please explain the difference between caps versus cheap water for everyone regarding water conservation, but obviously it's open to everyone to answer if you can.
Well, I'll hand it over to Katie first.
Oh, I was going to say, I think Kahreen's presentation does pulls up this tension, right? What she said here, in the fact that when water's cheap, there's less of a market incentive to conserve water, and therefore we worry about overuse or not being good stewards of the resource. And we want to balance that need with ensuring that everyone has access to water. And so I think that the takeaway here in how to square that circle is to use the type of advanced data tools and to differentiate who we're charging water for and how. And yeah, Kahreen is really an expert and a practitioner doing this work. So if there's anything to add.
No, I think that was a great summary. And I also think to Alexandra's point about, you know, if somebody's not able to pay, then it's really sort of a lose-lose situation to shut them off, right? But the difficulty is, how do you determine if somebody is unable to pay, right? Do you sit down with an accountant and look through their bank statements and determine what their expenses are and what I mean, no, you don't, right? It's very difficult to know, to be able to distinguish. And I also think that the predictive analytics is a really important tool to help us actually have some real data about somebody's ability to pay, and not just from public information about their neighborhood, but our own information as the utility, that we have this financial relationship with them, and we can look back and we can see, you know, they've asked for payment plans multiple times, they've qualified for assistance before, they pay in cash. These are all indicators that somebody might be financially constrained, and we can use that to shape how and when we do shutoffs and hopefully reduce them.
Any further questions while we keep these people on the spot, or is it time to let them go and move on to the next panel? Because we're Zooming, I'm going to let you walk out when you need to, and I'm going to move on to the next panel,